Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another wonderful tasting with the Virtual Tasting Society. As always, I'm Vadim Perlovsky, and today we're excited to welcome a brand that really idolizes everything that we're about. Super nerdy whiskey. Let's get talking granular level. Let's talk terroir. Joining us today for this tasting with Waterford single malt Irish whiskey is the founder and the CEO, Mark Reynier. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, Mark Reynier. Yeah.
Mark Reynier, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We're excited to have you. We're excited to learn from you. I do want to say thank you to Jane for helping to organize this and putting this together. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Everyone should have in front of them 6 samples of different expressions from Waterford. What we are tasting today is the Cuvée, the Gaia 2.1, Luna 1.1, Rathclogh. You'll pronounce that better than I will. Dunmore 1.1 and Dunbell 1.1. Is there a specific order you'd like us to go in, Mark?
Yes.
Okay.
And no. All right. The 3 single farms. Dunmore, Dunbell, Rathclogh. It doesn't matter which order you do them, but those 3 you need to taste together. Okay. All right. So what I'd suggest, hello everybody, and happy Thursday. What I suggest is you have those 3 in front of you, and like a xylophone, just go up and down, nose them, and then add a little bit of water, just a couple of drops. That's all that's needed, and see what happens with that water. Just nose up and down. And I'll rabbit on, I'll talk away, but the idea is you are going to do the tasting. You guys know how to taste. You don't need me to tell you what to see in this whiskey. You're going to discover it yourselves, all right? So you know, this is a tasting that you are going to do the work. I'll talk, you do the work, all right? So the 3, once you've added a drop of water, again, just keep smelling. You don't need to start drinking it yet. Just keep smelling. What I would then suggest, because as you see it evolve in the glass with the water, with the air, what I would then, I don't know how you do it normally, but what I would then suggest you do is add a little bit more water, just to dilute the alcohol to a texture that suits your palate and the time of day, and then drink the buggers. That's what I would do, all right? So you know, we talk about tastings, and I get sort of, you know, tasting is different things to different people. To some people, it's just drinking very, very slowly. To other people, it's, you know, a laboratory and you're nosing only. For this intents and purposes, it's an introduction to what we're doing at Waterford. And, you know, whiskey's for drinking. So yes, let's nose it, and nose it brut, nose it with a drop of water, and then nose it again with a little bit more water, and then drink it. All right? So, you know, the point is, it's meant to be a pleasure. So it's in your hands. I'm not going to stop until we get to the end of those 3. I'm going to talk to you about those 3 whiskies, and then we'll do a pair, which will be the organic and the biodynamic, and then we'll finish with the Cuvée. All right, so it's 3 absolute distinct sections, and I'm not stopping you drinking. I'm not going to stop you. You know, you get stuck in. All right. I mean, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is I'm not going to lead you up the garden path and tell you what to taste. You can taste and make your own assumptions, because you know you all know how you've been doing this many years, so you all know how it works. All right. So about me. I'm actually a wine man. Well, I started out as a wine man in 1980 in the London wine trade. I was very lucky to be in Burgundy primarily during the 80s and 90s, which was a very big time for a renaissance of terroir in Burgundy. Remember, after the Second World War, France was pretty socialist, and communal winemaking combined with a poor weather pattern, excessive agrochemical input, and the difficulty of making wine, even at 12% alcohol, without having to add sugar. You know, it was a pretty lousy 2-decade era. But then things changed in 77 onwards. We went into another weather cycle, the one we're in at the moment. And now it was a question of trying to keep the alcohol down to 12 degrees. But it also heralded a much more rewarding era of investment, knowledge. Rosewood University, Davis University in California, all young French guys went to learn there. And thanks to you guys, it basically came back with the knowledge, the science of wine, not the folklore, the science, which they applied to their historic terroir, the terroirs that have been lost through this excessive use of agrochemicals. And this 80s, 90s renaissance, rediscovery of the historic terroir by this new generation, I was there, and I found it absolutely riveting to discover and share concepts like thermoregulation, extended fermentation, organics, biodynamics, the integration of wood, cask maturation, all these things, and the influence of stainless steel and all these new ideas. And coincidentally, at the same time, we had the birth, the naissance of single malt whiskey. Everybody thinks single malt whiskey's been around for years. It hasn't. Or rather, I suppose it has. It's just we didn't know about it. It was deliberately suppressed. Suppressed. Oh, by the way, if you want to stop me at any point, just please, put your hand up and ask questions away. I'll be very happy to answer. So by all means, interrupt me. So this naissance of single malt came out from underneath the protection of the whiskey industry. Remember, in Scotland, 80% of Scottish whiskey is made by just 5 companies. In Ireland, 80% is made by 1. So this consolidation is huge, and therefore the power to suppress and determine the narrative of what whiskey is in both Ireland and Scotland has been very effectively done. So in Scotland, nobody wanted you to know about single malt whiskey. It happened by accident, a very fortunate accident. And it's to do with, I suppose it's quite pertinent to where we are today. It's to do with 2 oil crises. The first oil crisis was in 72, 73, the OPEC oil crisis. I look around and many of you are alive then, but it was a dramatic era in the early 70s, particularly in Europe and the UK. And it resulted in many distilleries, older distilleries, smaller distilleries, being shut down. They were shut down, and their distilling capacity was transferred to bigger distilleries, more efficient distilleries. And in my book, it's what heralded the end of the period of innocence and the beginning of an era of industrial distillation. And I'll explain what I mean. And it's not definitive. It's, don't hold me to those dates, but it's roughly 1973. To me, that's the pivotal moment, the turning point, when it was the end of the original independent distillers, those clandestine distillers that became farm distillers, that became the Ardbegs, the Port Ellens, the Bowmores that we know today. And elsewhere in Scotland, some of those distilleries were shut down because they were surplus to requirement, or, as far as the big guys are concerned, inefficient in their production. It was an era when people were using more regional barley, and most of all, decent wood, something that is terribly forgotten. So the 73 oil crisis heralded a big change. Now you had fewer distilleries, but more efficient. It was about producing the cheapest liter of alcohol possible. So that meant, well, where's the cheapest barley? If it comes from England or it comes from the Ukraine, well, fine, okay, forget Scotland, we'll get it from over there. We'll run the distilleries faster, because the faster you distill, the cheaper the alcohol. Okay, so it may be thinner, it may be less interesting, but it's going to be cheaper. And then what are you going to put it in? Well, we'll put it in, well, we won't buy new barrels. We'll just reuse the ones we've already got. But won't that make the whiskey pale and insipid? Well, it doesn't matter, does it? Because, and this is the caveat, it was always destined for blending. It was never intended to be bottled as single malt. This hadn't happened yet. So no one was ever going to know. So this speeded up industrialized distilling. Well, hey, it just made the economics better. And it made your blended whiskey cheaper, because single malt, as you well know, was sort of added as a whiskey flavor to silent whiskey, column still, bland, a mass-produced spirit. So the single malt was being added to give it its whiskiness, because single malt's flavor, what makes it the most flavorsome spirit in the world, is barley. And column still spirit is made from the cheapest grain possible. Normally it's corn or maize. I don't know what you call it in America. And it doesn't have the same flavor profile. We know that there are 2,000 flavor compounds in barley. That's what makes it the most flavorsome spirit. And those flavors, more or less, were being added to this silent whiskey to actually give it a whiskiness. So 73 heralded, well, I would call it a sort of shameful era that we're still in today. And it's everything I do against this background of industrial distillation. Now, what made matters worse was the availability of barrels. And as I implied earlier, Scotland, Ireland benefited massively from the fact that we're islands, and every wine whether it's port, Madeira, Bordeaux, Burgundy, everything had to come in a barrel. And it came to the UK, to the ports, Bristol, Liverpool, Dublin, Waterford, London, Edinburgh. And that's where it was bottled. That's where all the famous traditional wine merchants were located, because that's where the wine came in. They bottled the wine, and the barrels, redundant, were sent to Scotland. So for a century and more, the Scotch and Irish whiskey industries benefited from these cast-off barrels, a multitude of different wines, different wood types. Fantastic. Everybody takes that for granted. But that all ended during the 70s, that same era. And it was heralded by various wine scandals, the lack of confidence in British bottling, and the desire of the top wines in France to bottle their own wine, because up until the 60s, very, 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 very little was bottled sur place, at the origin. You bought the wine, it was sent to you in barrels, you do the bottling. But with these wine scandals and the lack of confidence, more and more wine was bottled at the chateau, mise en bouteille au chateau. And of course, that meant the barrels weren't there. So during the 70s, all those wonderful wine barrels, port, Madeira, and everything, they stopped arriving. So even more reason to recycle the ones that you already had. So roll on a decade to 1982, and there was another oil crisis, almost exactly a decade later. Now, this time, the big whiskey companies, they thought, well, hold on a second, we're not selling as much as we were, and we've got all this stock here. The stock, versus our usage and our extrapolations doesn't match. So I think we ought to sell off some stock, bulk stock. And what they decided to sell was the whiskey from the distilleries that they'd already shut down. No point hanging on to it because you couldn't make any more. So they offloaded these whiskies into the bulk whiskey market, intended for other people to use for blending. And this heralded, or rather augmented, the independent bottling market, the concept of third parties buying barrels distilled by other people and bottling it under their own label. I mean by that, people like Gordon MacPhail, Signatory, my old company, Murray McDavid, these sort of people, who are buying barrels and bottling often whiskies that were much more interesting than the standard official bottling of that distillery. Now, with this new supply of whiskies, many of them distilled in the age of innocence. In other words, better barley, slower distillation, better wood, suddenly appeared on the market, cheap as chips. And this was the catalyst for the extraordinary development of single malt whiskey. Without that liberation, we wouldn't be here today. So when we talk about single malt whiskey being around for years, it really, as an industry, it started really 83, 84, 85. So what's that, 40 years? Now, there are exceptions, of course. 1973, that miraculous year, well, that saw Alan Sheack introduce Macallan as a single malt, but hey, no one knew what single malt meant. A decade before that, well, almost 61, I think it was, or 62, Glenfiddich was released as a single malt. But by 1985, single malt accounted for 0.01% of whiskey. It was nothing. Now it's 20% by value. So it's been an extraordinary development, and it was given, it was turbocharged by the fact that Diageo, the biggest of them all, owns 32 distilleries, or 40% of all Scotch whisky. They saw what was going on and they jumped on the bandwagon, and that gave single malt credibility. So these pirates, these independent bottlers, hardly, barely tolerated by the industry. It was given credibility by the fact that Diageo, with owning all those distilleries, jumped on with originally the Classic 6, which eventually became the Classic 12, and where we are today. So Diageo could see which way the wind was blowing, and they jumped on. And thank goodness they did, because it did give it the much needed credibility. So where am I in all this? Well, I'm in Burgundy at the same time. I'm discovering, all this new stuff going on in France and about wood and everything, just as single malt whiskey is taking off. Now, the two paths come together because when I started my own wine company in 1985, I vividly remember thinking, well, I'm not going to bother stocking any whiskey. Who drinks whiskey? It was the war generation that drank whiskey. Single malt wasn't there. And, blended whiskey was, Johnny Walker and all that shit. None of my generation drinks whiskey, so what's the point? How wrong I was, because little did I know that single malt was just bubbling away. And the serendipity of this was that, excuse me, I went to the London Wine Show in 1985, the year before I opened my shop. And walking through this festival, I was abruptly accosted by a wonderful Scotsman, a lovely guy called Jack Milroy. Very, very heavily bearded guy, very gruff fellow. And he asked me, he said, do you want to win a bottle of whiskey that's worth £1,000? I said, well, sure, yeah, why not? £1,000. He said, well, have you got a visiting card? And I didn't. So he gave me his own, and I wrote my name on it, and I put it in the hat. And I forgot all about it. And at the end of the week, I got a phone call, and he said, you've won the prize. You've won this bottle, so come and get it. So I went to Milroy's in Soho. And Milroy's, at the time, was a legendary whiskey shop. And he presented me with the bottle. We took a photograph. It appeared in the wine press. And I said, you can't be serious. This whiskey stuff, it can't be £1,000 a bottle. You must be joking. He said, no, it is. It's 1,000. It was actually it was a Balvenie 50-year-old, their first one they'd ever done. And I thought this was, it was all too good to be true. And whilst I was there, he said, look, we ought to celebrate. I've got some samples here. Would you like to have a dram? And I confess, I'd never drunk whiskey in my life before. And so out of politeness, I thought, I can't refuse, taking 1,000. So, so I tasted the whiskey like I'd taste wine. I didn't know any other way. And it was an aberration. It was obviously, I now know, a series of Islay samples. So to start with Lefroy, Lagavulin, Bowmore as your first ever experience of whiskey, it was an abomination. And I was trying to smile and be polite. And then I hit on the whiskey. I thought, wow, this has got everything you'd expect to find in a wine. And I thought, well, this is extraordinary. And of course, it was Bruichladdich. And I remember coming away thinking, I discovered something that nobody else in the world knows anything about. I've discovered this whiskey stuff, this single malt, and I found one that actually has the attributes, the harmony that you'd expect to find in a wine. And so I thought, right, okay, I am going to stock a whiskey. I'm going to stock one, and it's a whiskey for wine drinkers. It's going to be this Bruichladdich. I'm going to find some, and I'm going to stock it. And I did. I tracked it down, and it was really difficult because remember, this is an era of consolidations, companies buying each other out. Nobody knew what they owned. I remember calling up Wycombe Mackay, Invergordon, saying, I'd like to buy some of this Bruichladdich stuff. And they said, well, why are you coming to us then? I said, well, you own it. Do we? I mean, it was that ludicrous at the time. People just didn't know what they'd got. Anyhow, so I started stocking Bruichladdich and selling it between 86 through to 89. And then I thought I ought to go and see it, this place that makes this extraordinary thing. And I went with my brother, and funny enough, it's the only holiday we've ever been on. And we turned up at Bruichladdich, and my heart sank. The place was a wreck. It was falling apart. There was rust everywhere. There were weeds growing out of all the gutters and everything. I mean, it was nothing like I imagined it. I was going to turn up at Chateau Lafite, and it would be all marvelous. And come on in, Mr. Reynier, lovely to see you. No, not a bit of it. And the worst thing was there was this little sign on the gate, padlock gate, and a little sign. It had 4 words, and it summed up the whole thing to me. It still does. 4 words: plant closed, no visitors, exclamation mark. Plant. It's a freaking distillery, but plant. Like factory, like and no visitors, bugger off, And I just thought, wow, And I saw somebody in the courtyard, and I rattled the gate, and a guy came over, and he was obviously not very happy at all. And I sort of, in my best sort of London, said, well, I've come all the way from London. I'm your best. I'm probably your only customer. And I was just wondering if you'd very kindly let me in to come and have a look around. And the guy said, no, you can fuck off. So I got sent away. And I was fuming, absolutely furious. And because I couldn't rationalize, the quality of this whiskey, at the reception, the terrible place, it just didn't make sense. And I thought, well, that's it. I'm giving it up. I'm just going to chuck it all out. I'm having nothing to do with this. And I got back to London. I chucked out, sold off all the bottles. That's it. That's me done. But it grated. It grated. And that January, after this time of year, after the excitement of the Christmas period and the great sales and everything, And I thought, you know what? I'm going to try and buy this distillery. If they don't care about it, I do. I'll try and buy it. Now, what's the worst that could happen? The worst is they'll say, well, look, thanks, but no. Of course they won't. Who am I? A private guy in this multinational industry. But at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have resolution, you know? So I did, I wrote. And I said, if I can see you're not using it, would you consider selling it? I would love to buy it. And of course, I got a reply saying, thank you very much, but, very nice of you, but no. Fine. All right. I tried. I got the answer I thought, but at least, I can live to fight another day, and I won't regret it. At least I tried. But you know what? I tried again and again. In fact, I tried every January for 10 years. And on the 10th year, 2000, they said yes. Amazing. Didn't expect that. So all of a sudden, Christ, now I've got to do something about this. So all panic, all hell broke loose. And by then I'd been developing my single malt whiskey interest via an independent bottling company I named after my Scottish grandparents, Murray and McDavid. And so I'd become more and more interested. As an independent bottler, you get to see everybody's dirty linen. And the state of the whole industry. And that everyone has this shocking wood policy. And there's good, there's bad, there's indifferent. You get to see, a bird's eye view of the whole thing. And I couldn't help thinking, I could do a better job. I could do a better job. Give me a chance. I want to have a go at this. And here it was. Here was my chance. Now I could buy a distillery. Now I would have to stump it up. Now I would actually have to stand up and do something. And it was a very fraught, very difficult process. Very difficult indeed. No bank wanted to know. Who are you? You're too big for a high street bank. You're not big enough for a merchant bank. But on December the 19th, 2000, at midday, we finally managed to buy what was the first distillery to be bought out of the whiskey industry. It was also the same day my son was born. My son, who now helps me in whiskey, loves to tell everybody that he's spent all his life in whiskey, and he means it. So December the 19th was quite a day, I can assure you. And that's the start of the Bruichladdich journey. We were able to buy that.
Nobody here, my parents never bought me a distillery for my birthday. That seems unfair. Especially one like Bruichladdich.
So then started this. Well, basically, we bought the whiskey stocks, 1.4 million litres at full market value at that time. And we basically were given the distillery for free. It was in such a poor state. They never expected it to work again, and how wrong they were. Because we spent, 5 months, because actually at the base of it, you had heavy agricultural engineering, solid cast iron cogs and wheels and everything. So actually the fundamentals were all there, really solid, very well designed. It just needed a bit of TLC. And so that's what we gave it. And in May 28th, we started distilling again. Bruichladdich came back from the dead. And the first barrel was filled by my son at the age of 5 months. So barrel number 1 was filled by him. And we sold the stocks, we bottled them up, we sold them off, and that was all very interesting, all great fun. But what I really wanted to do was grow my own barley, and I wanted to distill it my own way. That was the bit I was interested in, because coming from the wine world, I wanted to apply those techniques of terroir, which underpins all the great wines of France. Well, why shouldn't it work for whiskey? Barley's a plant, the vine's a plant, so why not? So, what is terroir? It's a word that puts the fear of God into most whiskey people. It has this cachet of French pomposity, a sort of a feeling of mystery, a feeling of folklore, of Hollywood. Actually, the problem is there's no English translation that adequately represents what terroir is. That's the problem. If there was, we wouldn't have that issue. So what is terroir? It's the three-dimensional interaction of the soil, the microclimate, and the topography on a plant. Not a place, not a person, not a distillery, not a region, a plant. Now, we know about it most because of the vineyards, vines. We know about it because Cistercian and Benedictine monks since the Middle Ages have been watching it. So terroir is something that happens to the plant. It's how that plant is nurtured. So we all know a plant, puts down roots, and those roots will go deeper and deeper if the soil is a living one. If you put fertilizer on the surface, well, then the roots don't go anywhere. They just sit on the surface and absorb all those nutrients. But the main roots go down deep. They pick up minerals, and that nourishes the plant. The microclimate, it might be protected by trees, for example, so it's protected from the wind. It might be on a exposed hillside with high evapotranspiration. It might be by a river where it's got humidity. It might be tucked in a bowl where it gets frost. It might be on a south-facing sort of sun track. These are all parts of terroir. You'll have seen it every day. You drive down a road, you see a farmer's field, and you'll see bald patches in the barley growing because there was a dip where water flooded. That's terroir. You'll see it where the barley or crop is thin because the soil is so stony, thin and drought prone. You'll see it where crops frizzle, in the sun because there's no water retention in the soil. All of this, we see it every day. This is terroir. Your mother calls it gardening. It's the same thing. There is no mystery about terroir. Just the bloody name. And I can tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen, that this word is going to be so corrupted in the years to come when the big guys get hold of it and start using, precisely because it's got this esoteric conception. It's going to be used and abused terribly. But what it really, and people start saying, oh, the terroir of people, the terroir of place, no, terroir happens to a plant, any plant. It just happens that we're talking about barley, or here where I am now in Grenada, we're talking about sugarcane or the vine.
But
So-
doesn't terroir come in as well when you talk about where the whiskey is aged, right? Because
No.
if it's aged
yes
near
and no.
the sea, you've got the
But yeah, you're right, but that's not terroir.
what do you call that? I mean, that's environment, and
Yeah, but it's not a plant, is it? It's a building. So that is a different thing. That's not terroir. Terroir is a plant. That is location. That is, and you're absolutely right. I think it's terribly important where warehousing occurs, because that's, well, you know, that's a whole nother subject. Since you've raised it, well, we'll happily go there. Warehousing. This is one of the things we discovered with Murray McDavid, was when you see everybody else's whiskey, we noticed that whiskies that were matured by the sea, not distilled, matured by the sea, had a distinctive characteristic. We even started putting it on the labels as coastal. There was a sort of brininess to them. Now, you all know some distilleries are located by the sea, most of Islay is, but very little of it is matured there. It's matured in central Scotland. I'm very pleased to see that Laphroaig has started maturing their whiskey there. That's good news. I mean, we did it with Bruichladdich from day one, because we knew that there was this brininess that was absorbed by the spirit through those autumn gales, those winter gales. Now, what we didn't know is actually what was going on. And what we've now discovered in Waterford is that seaside location needs to be exposed. It needs to be a flat coastline, not deep water right in. It needs to be one that's exposed twice a day, because then the algae eat the seaweeds with the air, with the sunlight, and they fart DMS, dimethyl sulfide. Now, dimethyl sulfide is a compound which is found in heavy concentration, truffles. In very heavy concentration, that revolting smell of rotting seaweed that you'll have come across, no doubt. But in very, very mild forms, very low percentages, it's what your doctor calls ozone. You know, that thing of, you know, march up and down a beach and breathe that sea air. The sea air he's talking about is dimethyl sulfide. Now, it's what the albatross uses to navigate the world. It's what most birds going up and down the coastlines are navigating by, is this gas, this aroma of dimethyl sulfide. It's a very important greenhouse gas. There are also vaporized sodium compounds too. Anybody who lives on Islay, you leave a child's bike out overnight, and in the morning it will be rusted right the way through. We know this from any warehouse you've been to visit, and the rust on the bands around the barrels. You know, this doesn't happen by accident. This is you know, salt. And salt molecules, vaporized salt molecules, and DMS are breathed by barrels, day in, day out, every day of the year. That's where this brininess comes from. Now, there's people that will insist insistently that that's not possible. Well, I'm afraid it is. So when we came to build Waterford, we built deliberately our warehousing on the coast. We found an exposed piece of coast, we got planning permission, and we built warehousing orientated to face the prevailing winds. That's how important I think it is. I firmly believe.
So that warehouse then has a flat coastline, right? So that you get the
High tide, low tide,
the long
high tide, low
tides,
tide.
right?
Yeah.
And then it also has the winds coming off the coast onto shore. Okay. So, but let's go back to terroir, because you don't have a name for that, but there's got to be a good name for that, environment or whatever. But let's go back to terroir.
Location.
Because we could go to the barrels, right? The barrels are made of wood. Wood is a plant. So where did the wood grow up? Now we've all tasted different oaks from different parts of the world. I mean, whiskey aged in oaks from different parts of the world, and we've noticed a big difference. But now you put wine into a barrel, and then you empty the wine out and you ship that wine barrel off to Scotland or Ireland or wherever, and you put some distillate in there. So there's terroir of the wood, and then there's terroir of the grape that was in there previously. So where do you stop with the terroir? I'm not harassing you.
I can see where you're going. Triple terroir. Wow. I bet Diageo will be onto that one. Triple terroir. I guarantee you they will. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, we all know, right? Because we all drink lots of different whiskeys that are aged in different types of barrels with different types of liquids.
Wood. So what's your question?
I guess where do you stop? Where do you say, okay, maybe you can't claim terroir anymore about the wine that was in this barrel? I don't know. I don't know if I have a really good question. I just think this is a fascinating topic.
The wine bit, I'm less interested because obviously we're not interested in the wine. We're interested in the oak, and this is something. This is my Burgundian, one of the formal parts of my Burgundian thing, because during that era there was a lot of experimentation, Kate, with oak. Up till then, nobody could afford to buy barrels because they weren't making any money. So everything got recycled, very much like Scotland. They couldn't afford to buy new barrels. The 80s came and they started making a profit. The weather got better and they started actually making their own wine instead of sending it to a cooperative. And they started actually making money. So they started reinvesting in stainless steel, thermoregulation, this sort of things, pumps, pipes, stainless steel vats. And of course, one of the things was pneumatic presses, and one of the things was barrels. And I can remember, so it was an annual thing. You'd go and do your annual trip around Burgundy, and there'd be something new, some new idea. And so I witnessed over a 20-year period the understanding of how to integrate oak. We all know that oak is the wood. Nothing I've ever tried has ever come anywhere close to oak. The Romans knew it. They gave us the word Cooper, after all. For drinks, whether it's wine or whether it's spirits or beer or anything, oak is the best thing. And believe you, I've tried everything. I've tried cedarwood, I've tried cherry, mulberry, chestnut, Hollywood. I've tried, interesting, fun, but ultimately crap. All right? They just don't work. And anybody who tells you otherwise or tries to persuade you to run 100 miles, it's a fact. It's just not real. Oak is the thing. All right? Now, you know as well as I do, you've got American oak, you've got Quercus alba, you've got French oak, Quercus robur, or European oak. You've got Quercus pendiculata, also European oak, but mainly it's Quercus robur. We have, well, you guessed this, Admiral Lord Nelson to thank for the fantastic barrels coming out of France. Without him, we wouldn't have them. Simple thing was all the great forests of France, and this is where we, Kate, come back to your terroir idea, were planted by Colbert and Napoleon. And the idea was to have decent oak, to build decent warships, to sink the Royal Navy. The only problem was, the problem with that problem is that oak trees take 200 years to grow, and everybody had moved to stainless steel and ironclads. So those forests got repurposed for the wine industry. So thank goodness for that. So thank goodness for, for the Battle of Trafalgar and dear old Lord Nelson, because otherwise we wouldn't have those barrels. So the French don't like to hear that, by the way. But so you have in France, which is what I wondered in, I amazed it, 10 forests that range from just below sea level to 4,000 feet above. This is terroir for you, Kate, because at 4,000 feet above sea level, the air temperature is a lot cooler, so that oak grows a lot slower, so the grain is a lot tighter. Sea level, it's warmer, it's hotter, it grows faster, the grain is fatter, the grain is more open. That has a big effect on what you put in it. And in between, so you have the forest, the forest of the Vosges Mountains at altitude, you have Limousin below sea level. And in between, you have Allier, Tronchet, Bertrange, and 5 or 6 other ones. So those trees and the grain, and therefore the barrels made from them, vary. And what was fascinating to watch was how the wineries adopted those different forests, the different characteristics, terroir characteristics of those barrels with their wines. And remember, wines, we're talking about 12–13% alcohol, not 70 of a spirit. And how much you could use new oak versus first fill versus second fill, where those flavors were reduced. And it was a fascinating, delicate operation, which I found absolutely riveting, how you incorporated that to produce harmonious wines. You matched the power of the wine to the percentage of the power of the oak. About harmony, I think it's probably one of the greatest things I ever learned. I don't want to drink a wine or a whiskey that tastes of wood. I want it to taste of barley. Very simple. I don't want to chew on I'll pick up a branch if I want that. I want to taste.
But then why
wine.
would you put it into an oak barrel at all? Why would you not just take the distillate and drink that directly?
Well, that's what they do. That's what they used to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's not what you're doing. You're putting it into wood.
Yeah. So I want to mature it. Now,
Okay.
Maturing happened by accident. You had, people distilling whiskey, Ushkavar, water of life. The clue is in the name.
Yeah.
All right. Aquavit, vodka, eau de vie, Ushkavar. What do they all have in common? They mean water of life. They were white spirits drunk off the still. No one bloody matured them. They were hoovered down straight away. In fact, the original whiskies of the islands were more like gin than the whiskey we're drinking now. This is the point, because white spirit, improperly distilled, they had to flavor it with whatever was on the hillside. And often that was juniper, it was you know, heather plants, whatever they could find. Now, as those distilleries became legit, as they became farm distilleries, because trying to stamp out that illegal distillation, the government's, the King of Scotland came up with that very simple thing of, if you can't beat them, join them. So instead of trying to stop this illegal distilling, he thought, we'll do it, what we'll do, and how do I make some money out of it? He came up with 2 rules. One is everybody can distill, but you have to have 2 things. You have to have a license, which will cost you £10, so we know where you are. And secondly, your still can't be a little homemade affair. It has to be at least 200 gallons in size. So in other words, all you little guys can bugger off, and you can either man up and make a proper distillery and we can tax you, or you illegal guys can just disappear. And that's exactly what happened. All the illegal guys just gave up. Why bother? The guy down the road could make it cheaper and better. And of course, the guys that adopted that idea of going legit were the guys who had the primary raw ingredient, the barley. They had the terroir. They had the ability to reliably grow barley. So the origins of our whiskey industry, the single malt, was based on terroir. The guys that had the ability to grow reliably good quality barley because they had a good terroir. They had a good soil, or protected soil, protected fields, whatever you want to call it. They were the guys that went legit. They're the guys that chucked the horses out, they chucked the cows out, they shoehorned in the biggest still they could fit into that little Hebridean byre. If you go to visit Laphroaig, for example, you'll see the vestiges of this process in action. You will see on the left, as you go in, the old byre, the small, it's now a visitor centre, the low-ceilinged Hebridean stables. On the right, you'll see the new still house, purpose-built, big, huge, great cathedral-like thing. And you'll see a whopping great wash still, but you'll see, I think it's marvelous, you'll see, like Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, 6 or 7 little small spirit stills lined up beside it, like a duck with its ducklings. Beautiful. They've replicated the same stills, spirit stills, again and again and again since those early days of the 19th century. I think it's one, there you have historically this transformation from that illicit distilling to farm distilling to modern distillery. In one distillery, you have it all there. So my assertion is that those original farm distilleries, and remember, Lagavulin means a mill. What were they milling? So it was about barley and good quality, reliable, and therefore I attest it was always about terroir. Now, the problem is that went out the window when these big distilleries got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you couldn't supply the barley locally. It was cheaper to buy it overseas. And in fact, perversely, the construction of Bruichladdich and Bunnahabhain distilleries in 1881, both of them the same year, as purpose-built distilleries. They weren't adapted farms or mills. They were built deliberately as distilleries in 1881. Why? Because for the first time, you could bring to Islay the necessary volumes of barley that the island could no longer produce. And instead of peat, you could bring coal. And coal, to drive the stills, as opposed to drying the barley, powering the stills. So Bunnahabhain and Bruichladdich both built not to use peat, to use coal. And that was in 1881. So that's sort of when the era of local barley was usurped by the economic imperative of increased volumes. And that is when that terroir link was cut. And I'm using Islay because I know it so well, but it applies elsewhere. In fact, the dates change. For example, Speyside was mainly peated whiskey until 1840. Then it wasn't a steamboat. It didn't have to wait for that. It was the railway, and that changed everything. So there's been these step changes. And of course, it's why Islay retained peat, because everybody else was now using coal. And of course, for blending, the addition of peated whiskey became quite a rarity. And therefore, those that were still doing it, it was worth their while because it was something that was unavailable elsewhere. So it was an affectation that kept Islay producing peated whiskey. People weren't drinking it, it was going into blends. I mean, this is how it is. I mean, whilst we're at it, you another I'll throw in for free. This idea of Speyside, Islay, Campbelltown, Lowland, these regional things. Everybody thinks, oh wow, it's all stylistic. No, it wasn't. It was to do with controlling distilling licenses. Wherever the licenses needed controlling, they made a regional office. So why Campbelltown, you say? Springbank and Glencoe. Well, back then there were 32 distilleries there. That merited, being controlled. Lowland distilleries, there were 31. Islay had 20. They were terribly wee. They were doing, 30,000 litres at that time. Those original first official distilleries. Speyside, well, that's, lots of barley, lots of water, lots of coal, but that's the origin of those regions. Okay, you could argue that Lowland, triple distilled is Lowland, Lowland is triple distilled. Well, that was because you had lots of Irish immigrants coming into the steel houses and the shipyards, and they wanted light spirit. So that's, a lot of it was being distilled to go off south of the border. So that's, for a metropolitan consumer, that's what was wanted. So I don't buy this idea, this neat sort of, these regions equals, distinctive. No, not at all. It was administrative. Anyhow, we've diverged a long way from my story. Yeah,
so, but this is terrific. And actually that makes me ask, are these doubles distilled or triple distilled? Okay. That makes sense to me because of the flavors I can taste. So, yeah.
And I hope you can't taste oak, because if you taste oak, I haven't done my job properly. Now, this is one of the great perversities. I spend 30% of the cost of production on wood. I believe it is the industry's finest portfolio of oak. That is the degree of importance that I apply to barrels, as we discussed, Kate. And I do it precisely so you can't taste it.
Okay, then why bother? That goes back to that question I asked earlier. Why not drink just the distillate straight up?
Right.
Why oak at all?
I do like you, Kate. I do, because these are great points. Now, I'll tell you precisely. I hope you're drinking whiskey whilst I'm saying this. I wish to God I had one in front of me. But do make sure you are drinking that whiskey and enjoying. Before I get to you, Kate, the thing you should. We'll talk about Waterford whilst we're there, because from Brookladdy I went to Ireland. I went to Ireland because that's where the best barley in the world grows. And that's the only reason I went to Ireland, because they've got the barley. Waterford is 240 miles due south of Bruichladdich. You go out the gates of Bruichladdich, you go 180 degrees on your compass, and you arrive 240 miles later at Waterford. You'll get wet feet, but you'll get to Waterford. It's the same latitude as Cambridge. It's the sunny southeast corner of Ireland. It's glacial soils. It's ameliorated by the Gulf Stream. It's a maritime climate. It's ideal. Ireland's greatest exports, apart from people, is racehorses and cows. And they both eat grass. Barley is a grass. So that's why I couldn't give a tinker's cuss about the rest of the Irish whiskey industry. It means nothing to me. I am there to distill the Scottish way with their barley. I'm an interloper. I don't deny it. I'm there for their barley. It's the best. And I was extremely, serendipity strikes again. The day I arrive, Diageo decide to shut down their most advanced brewery they'd ever built in Waterford on the banks of the River Suir. 40 million euros of technical brewing marvelous. And they shut it down a decade after building it. And I turn up, you go, hey, now this is an important point, because you guys have been told by everybody that sits here and waffles on about whiskey, it's all about the distilling, you know, it's all about the distilling. It isn't. I hate to disappoint you, but distilling's really easy. It's not alchemy. It's not magical. It's schoolboy chemistry. Oh, sure, it's nice and shiny and, you know, iconic photographs and everything, you know, but it's a doddle. Anybody could do it. There's only 3 things you need to know, all right? According to Reynier, 3 things you need to know about distilling. First thing, the shape of the still. Well, we've known for 140 years what that shape is. You've seen it everywhere, you know, nice sort of pot with a tall, narrow neck, not the little swan and duck with, you know, ducklings of Lefroy, which produces a very heavy spirit, but tall. That was worked out back in the 1880s. Various other things, you know, bulbs in the neck, everything to try and get that copper contact and that purity. But at the end of the day, it's tall and narrow. That's what produces the purest spirit. Second thing is how greedy you're going to be with the middle cut. The greedier you are, the cheaper the spirit, but the weaker it is. The more miserly you are, the purer the spirit, but the less you have of it, the more expensive it is. That's probably the most important thing. That famous middle cut. It's miraculous how nobody will ever actually tell you any details about this middle cut. They'll waffle on about, oh yes, the middle cut. But the middle cut, that margin between the impure foreshots or what's the other term?
Heads.
Heads, thank you. Heads or foreshots, which is basically methanol, which will kill you. And then the other side of the sandwich, which is the tails or the feints, which is just impurities that aren't very nice. So the middle cut is a very precise thing. And if you are going to be greedy, you'll take more and you'll infringe on the impurities either side. you'll make a less pure spirit, one that will give you a hangover, if it doesn't kill you. If you're very miserly, you ensure that you're only getting the purest spirit. You reject the likelihood of either side of the impurities. It means you are rejecting potential alcohol that you could collect. In Waterford's case, we reject between 60 to 80,000 litres of whiskey a year that we could collect, but because I want that purity, we don't. Now, to put that in perspective, that's about a third of Springbank's annual production, all right? Because I want that purity. So I can tell you quite happily, I can't put it on the label, but I can tell you that you will not have a hangover after tonight with these whiskies, assuming you don't drink anything else that's not Waterford. You will not get a hangover. And I can attest to this, having test-driven this several times myself. That's what purity is. And that's what you're tasting here. You're tasting the purity of that middle cut. Now, I said there's three things. The third thing is the rate at which you run those stills during the middle cut. The faster you do it, yeah, sure, the cheaper it's going to be, but the thinner the spirit is going to be. Now, if you slow it right down, the more glutinous, the more rich, the fatter, the oilier the spirit's going to be. That's what you're tasting now, that unctuous mouthfeel, because we slow it down to 350 litres an hour. It barely gloops out. You can see it coming out of the spirit cell. You can see the texture of it. That's what you're tasting. Hold your glass to the side. Look at the legs when you tip it sideways. That's the viscousness that you get from slow distillation. So distilling, it's a doddle. No, my friends, the difficult bit is fermenting. That's the real thing. The trouble is it's really unsexy. There's nothing to see, and it all happens in a tank. So no one's interested. And of course, it should take a long time of nothing. Now, at Waterford, we have what I always wanted from my Burgundy days. This Willy Wonka's factory of stainless steel wonderfulness that you'd never find normally in a distillery. I brought the stills to this brewery, all right? The stills came from Scotland. The stills I stole from Inverleven on the River Clyde. I stole them, fun enough, the same year that this brewery was being built, 2004. So I took them to Bruichladdich. We had them standing outside Bruichladdich. We intended to use them, but it never happened. So I stole them a second time. I stole them from Bruichladdich and installed them into Waterford. So these have traveled quite a lot, these stills. They were built in 1974 for Inverleven by Blair's, an old, very old copper smith. So when I say that Waterford is distilled the Scottish way, I really mean it. In Scottish stills, double time. I am not interested in anything else. I've done triple distillation. I've done quadruple distillation. I'm not interested. I only want to distill barley, and I want to do it twice. To me, that is the ultimate. So I know exactly what I want to do. And this brewery gives me that fermenting experimentation that you could never, ever have. So the other thing that you're smelling, and perhaps it's the thing that you smelt first, and it might have actually surprised you, that for the first time, you smelt barley. not some weird wood finish you smelt barley. This is the thing. This is the hallmark to these whiskies. They all smell, heaven forbid, of what it's made from, barley. Now, one of the reasons this is so dominant is that at the core of this extraordinary brewery is a unique mashing and milling operation. And people say unique all the time. I mean unique. It's the only one in the world. And it's a holy trinity. The way we mill and mash at Waterford is totally different to anybody else. It's upside down. And it starts, that trinity starts with the milling. We don't roller mill like everybody else. We mill anaerobically. We mill underwater. So if you've been to a distillery and you walk into the mill house, you smell Waterford, you smell barley. But the trouble is, it's in the air, not in the whiskey. At Waterford, it's in the whiskey because it doesn't escape, because it's milled anaerobically. That's the first thing, all right? So we end up with a mash, which is 100% milled, not the traditional 70, 20, 10 mix, which allows for the percolation of water through the mash to extract the sugar. We're not percolating anything. We're pneumatically pressing the buggery out of this, all right? So it's a completely different scenario. So anaerobic milling. So we end up with no husks, but 100% milled grain in our mash tun. We heat the whole thing up. We don't dribble water through it and try to guess what temperature is going to activate these natural sugar enzymes. We heat the whole thing up because it's all liquid anyhow. And that means that those enzymes, the sucrase, the fructase, and the maltase, are activated at whatever temperature happens to be the one for today. We find where it is. So we get total conversion, total 98% conversion. We then pneumatically press it. Not once, but 54 pneumatic presses. The same things I saw in Burgundy. Big, basically rubber sacks that are inflated by air that squeeze the mash to the maximum. It is the ultimate terroir extraction system. Now, a mash filter, they're not unique. I think in Scotland, there are 2 distilleries that have mash filters, but they don't have the other bits that we've got. So that pneumatic pressing, I couldn't have designed it better if I'd tried. And it was all thanks to Diageo. They did it for efficiency. I've just repurposed it for terroir extraction. So that's how we get the maximal barley flavor that you're tasting there. And that runs through all our whiskies. Then, of course, we ferment it. So the industry, it may surprise you to know, ferments as fast as possible. Time is money. They perform a thing called a high density fermentation. They put double the volume of yeast in so that they eat up that sugar as quickly as possible. Huge amounts of carbon dioxide, volatile, like a Pepsi Cola bottle. And it's all over and done with within 24 hours, a day. And then they move to the next. time, space, money. Now, the older distilleries, the more traditional, they'll 48 hours with half the level of yeast. It's a smaller, it's slower, calmer fermentation. 48 hours. If it's a weekend, it might be an extra day. 48 hours. But I've got toys. I've got stainless steel fermentate. I've got 16. I've got them coming out of my ears. And they're all thermoregulated. They have a water or glycol going around outside to control the temperature within an instance of its life. I saw this in Burgundy. I've always wanted to be able to control the fermentation, because in Burgundy, I witnessed what happens when you do. Instead of leaving it to nature, which is what they used to do, or the advanced guys would take a radiator off the wall, plug a hose pipe either end, and run cold water through it and chuck it into a vat. But that was a sort of Heath Robinson affair. But then they got into stainless steel and thermoregulation, which enabled you to extend the fermentation by, and we're only talking about 5 degrees. People think of temperature control, that you're freezing, that you're not freezing it. You're controlling only 5 degrees between roughly 28 and 33. You're stopping it going any further. So you're not cooling it down, you're just stopping it rising, if that makes sense. And that means the yeast become a bit more soporific. They eat the yeast a bit more slowly. So it takes them longer to eat the yeast. So the fermentation can be extended. Not 2 days, not 3 days, not 4 days, but 7. I've got the space. I've got the time. I've got the inclination. It gives us more intensity of flavor. Right? Longer fermentation, more intensity of flavor. Then we come to distilling. I've told you that already. The purity of the spirit comes from the very slow middle cut, the unctuousness, and the purity comes from the narrow, miserly middle cut. That's Waterford. That's what you're tasting. You're tasting barley up front, in your face, ultimate terroir extraction. You're tasting an unctuous, green, oily spirit because of the slow distillation. The intensity of flavors coming from the slow, long fermentation, and the purity of spirit, as I described, from that middle cut. That's the hallmark to Waterford, whichever farm it comes from. Now, remember, I set up Waterford because of the barley. I wanted not one supply, I wanted as many different supplies as possible, because I wanted, and I knew from Isla, that if you grow barley on that farm, on that field, with that soil, with that microclimate, that topography, it produces a different result to the one over here. And I knew this from the first time I invited all the farmers down that had taken the challenge to grow barley for me. And I gave them a sample of their own spirit, and they tasted their own spirit. And then they started, well, apart from running around like a proud peacock at how good their spirit was, they then started arguing with each other about why theirs was better than the other. And then they started trying to rationalize why. Your soil's sandier. Perhaps it's because it's stonier. You had these gruff farmers debating terroir. If you'd even mentioned the word, they'd have probably thumped you. And so when I went to Ireland, I wanted as many terroirs as possible. In fact, everything was going to be a different terroir. It's not as easy as you think. Barley ripens within a 4-week window at the end of, in Ireland where we are, the end of July. So you've got to harvest a whole and stock a whole year's worth of barley in 4 weeks. So you need a depot, an entrepot that you can store 5,000 tons of barley from 35 different farms and keep them separate. So we built the cathedral. It's cathedral because it looks like one, it feels like one, it's ecclesiastical. Each bin is dedicated to a different farm. It is harvested during the day, 3 trailers worth. It arrives in the evening. It is dried overnight, and it is stocked in its own bin by the morning. So we have, for the first time, the ability to separate out each of these farm units. They're not put together, they're kept separate from the field to the cathedral. And there, in ideal conditions, they go into dormancy until the spring, when they come out of dormancy because they think it's springtime and it's time to start growing again. And that's when the malting is done. And as you know, malting is that rather naughty trick of kidding the barley into growing and then stopping it. Growing because it needs energy to grow those little shoots and those little roots. And that energy comes from converting the starch that's in the grain into pre-sugar. That provides the energy, and that's when we stop it. We stop it by desiccating it. And that's where the peat bit comes in. If you're going to use peat, that's the time you use it. You dry that barley over peat. Otherwise, it's just hot air. And so then you have a dried 10%, 12% humidity grain, and you've stopped the germination, and you don't need roots, you don't need plants, you just need that pre-sugar. Then you can mill and mash it, the rest of the story. Now, serendipity, I was very fortunate to discover there are only 2 malting houses in Ireland, and they're huge. But when these guys heard about what I wanted to do, they were prepared to resurrect an old 1960s maltings that they had put into mothballs many years earlier. A malting that had been built by Vickers. And a Vickers, it's a rather, well, it amuses me. Vickers were the guys that built the Hurricane in the Second World War. But they also diversified into agricultural equipment. And they owned Bobby, the agricultural engineer that produced malting facilities. They also diversified into owning Invergordon. They also, as a result, used to own Bruichladdich. So it's quite an odd cycle there. So this old 1960s malting was renovated for our use. And the deal was we had to fill it to its optimal capacity to make it worthwhile. That optimal capacity was 90 tons of barley, 2 tanks of 45 tons. Now that 90 tons gives us, once it's malted, 70 tons. That 70 tons, once we've distilled it, gives us 200 barrels. That's the unit of Waterford. Each of the 35 farms gives us 200 barrels. All right, does that make sense? You follow me? Now, Kate, now we can talk about wood, all right? because it now goes into barrel. Now, you've heard, I'm sure, it makes me sick, that the number doesn't matter, it's 70 or it's 80. 80% of a whiskey's flavor comes from the wood. I'm sure you've heard this old nugget. Absolute bollocks.
But it's true for so many whiskey producers. They really rely heavily on the wood.
They rely on the wood, but it's a false statement.
Okay.
It's an absolute false. Put it this way, Kate. If I put water into a barrel, does that make whiskey?
No.
Of course, no, of course it doesn't.
No, but it flavors the water. But it flavors the water.
It does, but into an acidic, vile, horrible, undrinkable thing. You know, you could put 100% neutral spirits into a barrel. It sure as hell ain't whiskey. Kate, come to Waterford. I'll let you try it yourself, because we do it precisely to show people how absurd that statement is.
I'll be there.
Absolutely absurd.
My mind is blown by what you're doing, and I feel like nobody should compare what you do to what other whiskeys do, because they really rely. Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. But the statement still stands. 80% of a whiskey's flavor comes from the wood is just dishonest, lazy, smoke and mirrors. That's why we finish. Excusability. It's wrong. Barley, whiskey's flavor comes from barley. Otherwise, we wouldn't use it. We would use much, much cheaper corn. We use barley because, as we know at Waterford, there are 2,000 flavor compounds. They appear in the grain. They are influenced by terroir aspects, as I described. We know that 60% of those flavor compounds are influenced by terroir. Nobody, not even the French, had bothered to prove it. They just take it for granted. Our study was the first one ever. I did it with Dr. Dustin Herb of Oregon University, Scotland's leading whiskey laboratory, and the Irish Ministry of Agriculture. We did it over 3 years. It is the test of all tests. It exists. The Scotch whiskey industry didn't even know there were 2,000 flavor compounds. 60%. Now I can tell you this is hot off the press. No one else knows this. You're the first people ever to hear this. We now know how terroir works because we've carried on our studies with Dr. Dustin Herb, and the paper will be coming out this spring. But I can tell you, the way it works is that the genome of the barley plant, each flavor compound has its own gene. And that gene has its own on-off switch. That on-off switch is activated by environmental conditions. It turns it on like a thermostat. And then when the conditions change, it turns it off. That's how much of that flavor you've got. Now, think of it like a mixing desk, or some of you may be old enough to remember graphic equalizers, you know, the hi-fi thing, you know. You've got this mixing desk of all these buttons that control the treble, the guitars, the strings, the decibels, you know. That is the flavor compounds, 2,000 of those levers. Some of the barley has the levers pushed right up, and some of them has it not so far up. It's the same compounds, they're just there in different levels. That's how it works, right? I had to prove it. Not the whiskey industry, I did, because I was curious to know what happened. Our next study is what happens to those flavor compounds in the barrel. This is the next unknown. What I can tell you is the flavor compounds in the barley are exactly the same as in the ferment, in the wash, exactly the same in the new spirit, and exactly the same in the barrel and in the bottle. The flavor compounds are immutable. They cannot be destroyed. They do not go away. They are the same. All right? From the grain to your glass, they are the same compounds. But something happens to those compounds. They don't go away, but something happens to them in the barrel. And that's what we're trying to discover. What is it? We know, we talked about it earlier, dimethyl sulfide, that marineness breathing through the air. You all know about the angel share, the alcohol that evaporates away. Well, very simply put, if the alcohol's leaving the barrel, air's replacing it. Otherwise, there'd be a bloody vacuum. You'd never get the bung out. You'd never get the whiskey out of the barrel. The pore of the oak, it's a bit like Gore-Tex. It allows certain sized molecules in, but other sized molecules can't leave. As it happens, the alcohol molecules can leave, water molecules, not so much. So there's this thing where those flavor compounds that started, it's like a computer thing, you put, a computer program, you put shit in, you get shit out. If you put flavor in to that barrel, you're going to get the flavor out. But something happens to it in between. It's called maturation. But what is happening? If the flavor compounds are the same, what's going on? Because we don't perceive them the same. Now, what we believe, and I'll get back to you on this next year, is the micro-oxygenation is very similar to what happens through the cork of a bottle of wine, of serious wine. I'm not talking about everyday glugging stuff. I'm talking about, the great wines. You put that wine in a cellar, and 10 years later, you come back and it's mellowed and it's changed, and it's what we like. It's what we look for. Not everybody, but and it's this microscopic volumes of air. If you took, or you had a poor cork and too much air gets in, well, then the wine spoils, it over oxidizes. And the next step to that is acetic bacteria, and then you get vinegar. So the control of that air and the volume and the ratio to the liquid in the barrel is very important. This time it's going through the wood in microscopic volumes every day. We know that alcohol, the higher the strength you put it into the barrel, the more it extracts from the wood very quickly. It's the extractive phase. It happens in a matter of days. If the oak is fresh, if it's still got its lignin, vanillin, and tannin, that alcohol will pull it out in suspension very quickly. In fact, it's probably around about a month, 6 weeks, and it's pulled it out. If you use that barrel a second time, well, there's not much left. Either you've got to put the alcohol in at a higher strength to try and pull something out, or you're just going to get less extractive flavor. That's over and done with quickly, 6 weeks, okay? Then it's this micro-oxygenation. And what we can ascertain so far is the mechanism seems to be that those flavor compounds, for example, if you say that A is for apples, B is for bananas, C is for citrus, for example. So we can smell those. We can identify it. But what seems to happen with this micro-oxygenation is there seems to be a confusing. These flavor compounds seem to be ganging up to create the perception of something else, grapefruit, for example, or they are disguising, or they're augmenting, or they're subverting. It seems to be the mechanism. We're not quite sure what's going on, but bear with us and we'll find out. But the flavor compounds themselves aren't changing. They're just, that's the perception of what they're doing, this ganging up together. And that's what we call maturation. And it was accidental. It was never really meant to happen. You know, distillers back in the day would distill their new spirit. The Mr. Johnny Walkers of this world would buy it off the still, and they needed something to put it in. So they put it into barrels to ship it to their warehouse prior to being mixed together to create their blend. So back in the day, those whiskies were very, very young. In fact, the idea of 3-year-old whiskey by law, that was an accident. It happened in the First World War. It was an attempt to stop Glasgow dockers getting shit-faced and failing to turn up for work to load the ships with the munitions destined for the battlefield to fight in Europe. Because these dockers had been striking, getting more and more money because they knew just how important they were to the war effort. But they had nothing to spend the money on but alcohol. So they were drinking themselves to death and then failing to turn up to load the ships. And so the government said, well, we've got a terrible problem. What are we going to do? We're going to have to ban all alcohol. And they said, well, you can't do that. No, there'll be a riot. So Lloyd George, it was his idea. He said, well, I've got a much better idea. Instead of them drinking this, zero age hooch, if we then say, actually, the laws have changed for quality reasons, and now all whiskey has to be 3 years old. Well, in one fell swoop, we've solved the problem. They can't drink anything, but we haven't banned it. A wonderful, wonderful sort of civil servant idea that you can ban something by not banning it. So that's where the 3 years came. They thought by 3 years' time, the war would have been over and the problem would have gone away, but it never stayed. The 3 years stayed ever since. There is no qualitative reason that 3 years is the minimum age. It was purely a Machiavellian civil servant approach to dealing with excess alcohol consumption in Glasgow during World War I.
And you're saying that basically the whatever they can draw out of the wood can be done within 6 weeks or so. And it's that micro.
That's right. The extractive bit. So okay, so say you haven't got a fresh barrel. Say you've got a third fill or a fourth fill barrel. So all that goodness has gone, all right? So you're not going to get any color. Lignin, vanillin, and tannin. Well, vanillin, it's vanilla. It's the same compound as a vanilla pod. That gives you that caramel flavor. The lignin and the tannin, they give you color. That's why bourbons are quite dark in color, apart from the ones that have had color added to it, of course. So for Waterford, that's where we get our color from, naturally, using virgin American and virgin French. We do that to get color. We then reuse those barrels later on because there's still a lot of benefits to be had from it.
Are you charring or toasting your barrels before using them?
No.
So you literally just take wood, virgin oak.
No. The manufacturer of a barrel, they have to be, virgin American have to be charred to be able to, to shape them. They're not heavily toasted, but they have, they have to be heated Otherwise, you can't bend the wood.
Yeah, they heat them, but I'm guessing that they don't do like do they do
not a number 1, number 5 charred. No. These are heated, not charred.
Okay, interesting. Obviously, I'm guessing they're what is it, seasoned outside, just the classic everything, right? But just not doing that final step.
So air
dried.
The French ones are for 3 years.
Yeah.
The kiln, the American ones, we get ours from the Kelvin cooperage, and they are kiln dried. But we were talking about the terroir of wood. You've got the Ozark Mountains, and Quercus alba in general gives you these creme brulee flavors. They're relatively rectilinear, whereas the French oak, and remember that the staves are double the thickness. American oak is roughly 17 to 18 millimeters thick, whereas French oak is 32 to 35 millimeters thick. There's a reason for this. The different varieties of oak have to be coopered differently. French oak fundamentally has to be split along the lines of the grain, or the xylem and phloem, for those that remember their botany. American oak, Quercus alba, is the xylem and phloem. It's a bit like the sclerotic veins and arteries of an old man. They're bunged up by things called tyloses. So it's a bit like if you think of bamboo, bamboo with the knots in the bamboo. Think of it like that, the knots in the bamboo. The tyloses do the same thing. They block the movement of liquids up and down. And so if you saw that bamboo, it doesn't leak because you've got the knots. It's the same with the tyloses of American oak. You can saw it in half and it doesn't leak. Whereas French oak, without the blockages, without the tyloses, if you sawed it in half, it just leaks like a sieve. So French oak is split. American oak can be sawn, and that's why it can be made much lighter and much less oak used. But of course, you put a spirit in it, and the American oak is going to have half the wood impact that the French one does. Now, French oak, I have to warn you, can be excessive because of that. If you don't understand how French oak works, then you can bugger it up. It's too dominant. It's too domineering. Oh, Christ, we forgot the other two whiskeys, the organic and the biodynamic. Have you drunk them all?
Oh, everybody's on it. The discussion's going on. Everybody's there.
Organic, biodynamic, whilst we're at it, what's the point? Organic, no pesticides, no insecticides. It's the only Irish whiskey that is organically produced. It is, there's only 2 others in Scotland, Neen and Benromac. But we go for organic we are the biggest distiller of organic whiskey in the world, single malt whiskey. I love it because you just get more of everything. So we're about to do this summer the first single farm releases of organic. So we start to get a little bit of diversity in those different terroirs. The biodynamic, well, that's organic with knobs on. Biodynamic is, I mean, again, it's another word that gets everyone terribly worked up, and they shouldn't, because to all intents and purposes, everything before the advent of the agrochemical industry, everything was biodynamic, going back to Freddie Flintstone and the last ice age. It's not new. It's 16,000 years of farming know-how, survival. It's understanding the planet, it's understanding the rhythms and cycles of nature, everything that we've lost in our comfortable metropolitan lives. I mean, the residues exist. I mean, any of you guys that sail, you know about the influence of the moon. It's not spooky. It's not, you know that a full moon, you know, you're going to get spring tides and you're going to get neap tides. You know, if you don't, you're going to run aground, you know. So you know, these are knowledges, that the residues of this understanding of the rhythms of the nature, of the cycles of nature, that still are with us. We know that, you know, fish, you know, migrate up rivers on full moons, and we know that sap falls in roses and plants that need pruning after a waxing moon. This is, you know, old wives' tales, sure, but it's actually what our forefathers all took for granted, and a lot more besides. So biodynamics is nothing new. It is the most natural, normal matter of looking after a farm, an ecosystem. What it means is the soil has to be a living soil. You can't napalm it. It has to be living. Biodynamic soils normally have at least 150% more worms. They have a 130% more friable content. The root systems are 150% bigger than normal farming. So, you know, they go deeper, more minerals, more flavor. So biodynamics is, I mean, I've been following it again since Burgundy, since the 80s, assiduously. And I will always seek out biodynamic wines if I can. I mean, it has to be said, following biodynamic practices doesn't necessarily mean you're a great winemaker. It doesn't necessarily mean you've got a great terroir either. But it does mean that you're a very good farmer. And if you have a good terroir with a good winemaker, biodynamic production, well, you've hit the jackpot. And it's no surprise that the top 20 greatest wines in the world are all biodynamic. Chateau Latour, Chateau Lafite, Chateau Margaux, Chateau Yquem, Romilly Conti, Domaine Leroy, Olivier Humbrecht, Marcel Dice, you know, Trimbach, Le Fleuve, you know, and more are moving to this, I suppose you call it holistic way. This is the first biodynamic whiskey in the world. And I love it. It's still very young, but boy, it's just got more of everything. It's got something electric that runs through it. It's very hard to describe, but I've never found anybody that isn't moved by this whiskey. The purity, the expression, it is just different to everything else. And I would do everything biodynamically if I could. As it was, I had to persuade 3 organic farmers to up to that biodynamic level. And it took a long time to do it. But I'm very glad we did. And there will be a single farm variant coming out, not this year, but perhaps next year. And then to finish, you have what we call the Cuvée. This is the Waterford bottling. And actually, it's the raison d'etre of the whole project. The fact that we have everything as a single farm, that's our basic unit. 200 barrels from a farm, that's our base unit. Some of those farms are conventional, and some of those farms are what we call Arcadian. The times of the past: organic, biodynamic, peated, heritage. In fact, we've been propagating old varieties of barley in the search for the flavors that have been lost. Because one of the bizarre byproducts of our researches showed that whilst terroir does matter, the barley variety doesn't. And that was a real shock, a real surprise. And when we dug down to find out why, we were shocked to discover that every variety of barley propagated since 1973, this infernal date, has been propagated from the same parents. They were genetically cousins. So all that's happened, every new variety since 73 that we are obliged to use, thanks to Diageo and Pernod Ricard, everyone improved the spirit yield, it's improved the field yield, it's improved the climate adaptability, it's improved the reduce the height of the straw. All of these economic benefits, but never has the flavor changed. They've just replicated exactly the same flavors for 50 years. And I just think that's bloody criminal. So we've gone back to the future. We've gone back to find out what the hell were these flavors that have been lost. So from 50 grams of seed taken from the Irish Ministry of Agriculture, they very kindly let us rummage through their museum storage facility. We took 50 grams and turned that after 4 years into 50 barrels of Hunter from 1960, Goldthorpe from 1900, Spratt Archer from 1870, and wonderfully named Old Irish from the Middle Ages, a landrace, a naturally evolved variety that was existing before the modern varieties were propagated. So a project that's taken a lot of time to do, but boy, are the results worthwhile. Then you see what we've been missing. And it's a crime. There's no other word. It's a crime that we stopped that evolution in 73. So, what I'm going to try and do is make my own barley. And it's going to come like a greatest hits from these flavors of the past, married to a low straw modern variety for efficacy. And so we'll have to wait a bit. It'll be another, 4 years, I think, before we have a whiskey to show you made for the first time entirely because of the quality and flavors naturally occurring of the barley. So that's what we call Arcadian. So modern farming, you could call it regenerative farming, minimal intervention, and Arcadian farming going back to the past. So those are the 35 farms. And every year, the regenerative moved to the Arcadian increasingly. And then
Mark, quick question.
The point of that is to bring them together to create the Cuvée. That's the idea of the Cuvée. It's an assemblage of those terroir-derived flavors brought together to create complexity. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, we happen to have found the Hunter Arcadian barley available at a local retailer. So that's out. Okay.
Buy it. There's not much. Buy it. It's awesome. It's awesome. It's history. It's what it's what whiskey used to taste like. It's you're on a different planet. It shows you the criminality of what these big companies have forced on everybody. It shows you just what we've been missing. Fascinating, but there's not much, I'm afraid. So get it whilst you can. Yeah. We will do, I think next year, we'll do Goldthorpe. And then the year after that, we'll come back to Hunter. It'll be a bit older by then. All right. So the Cuvée is, again, it's a wine trade lift. It's a inspiration from the wine trade. Two people. One is Château Latour in Bordeaux. If you ever see a label of that, it's Grand Vin de Château Latour. It's the big wine because it's made up of 35 little wines put together, each one grown on a different terroir, vinified, harvested separately, barreled separately, and then put together to bring together a more complex wine, the big wine. It's the same methodology that champagne uses to create that complexity. And I've just, hands up, I've taken the same idea. I've laid down my ingredients. Each one of those 35 farms is a standalone single malt whiskey. You're drinking 3 of them. And by putting them together with their own fingerprint, with their own terroir identity, we are stacking one on top of the other to create like a millefeuille gâteau of delectability. That's the idea of the Cuvée. And we'll apply this to other bottlings in the near future. So that's the concept. That's what we're doing at Waterford. What are you doing?
We're drinking your whiskey and enjoying it.
Yeah. So to get back to you, Kate, the final thing I'll say before if you let me go to bed, the final thing about wood that we're talking about, there's 70% of flavor coming from the wood. What would actually be more honest is to say, and it's semantics, I accept, but 100% of a whiskey's flavor is influenced by its time in barrel. That would be honest. But to say, 80% of a whiskey's flavor comes from the wood is just wrong. It shouldn't.
But I think
terribly wrong if it is.
But I think I understand, because I think most whiskey makers rely very heavily on the wood for just the reasons you talked about, right?
Yeah,
because they distill very quickly. They get their barley from anywhere.
And in some cases, okay, I understand why. As I explained earlier, that great source of barrels, up to the 70s. I'm talking about Europe specifically. I'm talking about myself. Whiskey and Irish and Scotch whiskey. In fact, my first job in the wine trade was bottling the last of the wines to be bottled in London. And it was some joke Bordeaux, some humble joke Bordeaux, 1977 shit vintage. I can't remember what it was. But I remember addressing the barrels with a marker pen. I just wish to God I could remember the name of the distillery, but actually putting a distillery name because they were being sent off to Scotland. That was 1980. That was already the end. But, the 80s, 88 saw the end of sherry barrels. Sherry barrels are illegal to be shipped in bulk from 88 onwards. So where are all these sherry barrels that seem to be used by everybody coming from? There's something terribly wrong. The thing is, they're not really sherry barrels, or not at least what they want you to think of as sherry barrels. Now, there are cooperages in Sherryland, in Jerez. I've been there. I bought some. But actually, they're nothing more than American oak barrels with a bottle of sherry in, and they've rolled it around and told you it's a sherry barrel. Well, technically, it's a barrel from Sherryland, so I suppose it is. But it's a standard American barrel. There's nothing more, nothing less. So that's not right. And I'm sure people are buying those and then legitimately, as far as they're concerned, putting sherry on the label, because as far as they're concerned, it's a sherry barrel. It's actually E150, but let's not talk about that. Now, we know, you know, that sherry is produced in a unique fashion. It's called the Solera system. It's a pyramid of barrels. The barrels stay put for 100 years. The wine cascades from the top to the bottom over time to better assimilate it. And then that wine is bottled and shipped around the world. The barrels don't move. The barrels have no impact. They don't want it to have an impact. The barrels are neutral-ish. Now, every now and again, they'll replace those barrels. And those ex-Solera barrels are amazing because they're like sponges. The wood is completely inert. The wood is completely non-contributory, but it's impregnated with a century of sweet wine. So you put 70% alcohol in there, and you can imagine out it comes, black as the ace of spades, sweet as anything, like treacle, unusable. They have to be used very, very carefully. But they're very expensive and they're pretty rare. There are sherry butts in circulation still. I've seen sublime to ridiculous. I've seen 35-year-old Macallan from a sherry butt, and it's the color of water because that butt's been used so many times. There's not, it's not contributing anything at all. So there's a big deception going on, big deception about what is real sherry wood and what is pretend sherry wood, merely a masquerade for buckets of caramel. So I just throw that out there to you, to Kate and others, that nothing is quite what it seems. And so labeling, the more you see people boasting on a label about a finish, the more you should be suspicious. I mean, I went through Edinburgh Airport the other day and I heard a sales guy, explaining to some poor unsuspecting American tourist who was in there to buy a bottle of whiskey. After all, he's in Edinburgh. And the guy was saying, you like rum, don't you? The guy said, yeah, sure, I like rum. He said, well, you're like this. Glenmorangie, whatever it is. It's been rum cask finished. And you thought, this is the end days. This is extraordinary. Here we are in the heart of Scotland. And this guy is selling a whiskey as if it's a rum. It's nonsense. It's madness. And it is an existential problem. And I fear that some big companies have painted themselves into a corner from which there is no escape. They abrogated their maturation responsibility from 73 onwards for economic purposes. They never expected single malt to take off. They didn't expect it to ever happen. They expected that whiskey to go into a blend, which would be caramelized and whatever. They never, ever anticipated it going into bottle, but they've been found out. Now it is in bottle, and a lot of it isn't very good. So they're having to do a lot of smoke and mirrors to cover over their failure to put their hand in their pocket and buy decent barrel. Now here's a parting shot. If you ever get a chance to visit a distillery, use your thumbnail. It's always very funny. You'll always find somewhere a stack of barrels outside. So sidle up surreptitiously, bring out your thumbnail and scratch the front of the barrel. It's amazing because the barrel may be blue, it may be yellow, it may be red, the head of the barrel. and it's stamped with the distillery name. Now, each time that barrel has been used, they've had to repaint the end and put a new stamp on. And if you scrape away the paint, you can find out how many times it's been used. Red, black, blue, yellow, orange, 8, 9, 10 times. Without fail. It's a really funny thing to do. Well, apart from being slightly shocking, and as long as they don't kick you out of the distillery. But you'll find how many times about, and this is the problem, this excessive use of wood. As far as I'm concerned, I learned it at Bruichladdich. I certainly saw it at Murray McDavid. There is no shortcut for investing in wood. None. That's why I spend 35% of the cost of production on an unparalleled wood policy. Not just a few, the whole thing, everything.
But Mark, when you spend a lot of money investing in this, but you have said to us, we should not be tasting wood in this whiskey tonight.
Absolutely.
So are you investing in it to get that micro oxidization that you talked about earlier?
All of it. But the variety of wood, the portfolio of wood. Remember, each farm, 200 barrels. Each farm goes into the same portfolio, roughly 50% American, 50% French. That's split between Virgin American, Virgin French, First Fill American, First Fill French. What we call VDN, which is shorthand for Vin du Naturel, which is a French term, a French wine term for fortified wines like sherry. So the French versions, things like Banyuls, Riesalt, Morey, obviously decent sherry ones when we can find them, port barrels, Madeira barrels, Marsala barrels, anything that had a sweet fortified wine in, because those barrels are recycled. The wood is non-contributory, but it's saturated with sugar. And that gives us a natural sweetening essence if we choose to use it or not. And then the sixth element is what I call exotic wood. And that is exploration of oak varieties from around the world. And I recently found a variety called Quercus humboldtii, that grows only, it's the only oak in South America, and it grows in the Andes in Colombia. And the trouble is, and the interesting thing is, it's very high in eucalyptoids. So it has a sort of menthol impact, which is quite interesting. The trouble is getting the barrels, because there's obviously, as you're probably aware, there's quite a lot of activity in the forests of Colombia. So it's quite difficult to get those barrels. But so every farm goes into that portfolio, everything. So we have the ability to curate a bottling because we've got the harmonizing components there. We're not just French oak, we're not just American, we've got a bit of all. And if you look on the terroir code, each of these bottles you've had, on the back of the bottle is a terroir code. I think I've got one here. Oh yeah, here we go. Right. This is if you put that code into the Waterford website, you get 15 pages of technical data, the sound of the field, so you can sit in the field and listen to the sound of that barley that you are drinking. And I tell you, it sounds fun. It's absolutely addictive. Date lines, interview with the farmer, all the production details. So when I say it's a week of fermentation, you can the numbers are all here. You don't have to believe me, because I wouldn't believe anybody in this industry. this is my validation, okay? The map, so you can see where the actual fields, I'm trying to do this looking at the camera. How, well, it should go in a lot more than that, but I can't get it. Anyhow, so that's the fields used, that's the soil, so you can see where that is. More technical stuff. Oh, sorry, that's gone up too high. There you go. Then we come to the barrels used. Every single barrel that is in that bottling is listed here. So we have First Fill American from Heaven Hill. Oh, French oak from Chateau Lafite. US Virgin Oak. From Kelvin, and Van Du sweet wine barrels from Sauternes in this instance, right? They're all listed, every single barrel, where they came from, what the wood type is, and that's the composition of that bottling. Now, not every bottling is exactly the same composition. Ned will decide what he wants to do, but more or less, that's how it works. In this instance, 33% first fill American, roughly a third, say, okay? 22% virgin American, that's where the creme caramel comes from, and the color. 26% French, that's where the toastedness comes from. And 19% VDN, sweet wine, which is where the sweetness. So you can see how we are creating the bottling, harmonizing the bottling, a bit of sweetness, a bit of color, a bit of toast, a bit of so that we are letting the barley do the talking. You don't taste the oak. The day you do, I've fucked up. You shouldn't. It's the same with a great wine. You don't go and buy Chateau Lafite to taste the bloody forest. You want to taste the grapes.
Where
So
does
does that
this
mean,
go ahead, Vadim?
so does that mean you're not planning to do older releases? Like,
Oh yeah,
once
sure.
it hit?
Everything's maturing. Waterford
Okay.
is only getting older because the mistakes I made at Bruichladdich, I've rectified. So we have distilled a significant volume from day one. So we can revisit these farms, these terroirs again and again to the cows come in, because we have got 6 million liters of maturing single malt, unparalleled stock qualitatively. So yeah, it's only ever going to get older. The things that will remain for the time being young, or will lag behind, are things like the heritage barleys, which we've more recently it's taken us 3 years, 4 years to propagate. So we're behind the curve on those. So they'll always be a bit younger. But I think what you've seen here is something that we knew at Bruichladdich, that if you distill properly, if you distill with decent barley, if you use decent wood, it isn't really a surprise that the whiskey tastes very good young. And the fact that we beat 35 and 37 and 30-year-old whiskies time and again in comparative tastings shows that a lot of those old whiskies aren't in very good wood, and they weren't distilled very well. And they're not what they're cracked up to be. And they're certainly not worth the prices. And it's only going to get worse. The good news for you, for all of us, is that there's a new wave coming through. I put myself in that wave. I call it international single malt. And there's German distilleries and French ones and Welsh ones and Scottish ones, American ones, owner-occupiers, passionate people doing things the right way. depending on their budgets, depending on their status and whatever, perhaps not always be able to do what they really want to do, but at least their hearts are in the right place. So I think we're in a very exciting place for whiskey consumers, but that excitement isn't coming from the big players. They've shot their bolt. They've been found out. What they should have done when single malt took off back in the 80s is they should have done a parallel production, carried on with their cheapest chip stuff for blending, but they should have done a quality version for bottling. Once they knew that single malt was a thing, they should have used decent barley. They should have used local barley. They should have used decent wood. They should have slowed things down. They should have extended the fermentations, or at least not curtailed them. And then bottled them properly, naturally. So I think they missed out. That's what they should have done. They should have started that round about 1990, and then we'd be drinking 30-year-old whiskies that would be sensational. But they didn't. And I think that's indicative of the attitude, the exploitative attitude of the industry and the abrogation of responsibility. And it's up to us new boys to put it right.
So, Mark, I know it's late where you are. I'm not sure exactly where you are, but it sounds like you're at least 3, maybe 4 hours later. So I don't want to hold you, but at the same time, I do want to keep you because this is amazing. This is amazing and fascinating, and I'm learning so much. When can we do this again and delve into different aspects? I mean, I'm curious to know, how does peat impact all of this? Because that's got to be crazy different. But at the same time, if you're all about keeping the barley flavor, then you can't overpower it with the peat. So anyway, I don't know. That could go
I'll tell you very simply. I'll tell you very simply, because I was equally intrigued as you. I mean, surely peat is going to dominate terroir. You'd think, wouldn't you?
I mean, but peat in itself has its own terroir, right? Because
yeah.
Right.
But it doesn't. It doesn't dominate because we've done it. What we did is we took 2 farms, 15 kilometers apart. One's called Ballybannon, the other one's called Fenniscourt, in the county of Leith. And we took peat from a peat bank in between the two. Now, the problem is, in Ireland, there is no maltings that can use peat. All those old maltings went 100 years ago. As you probably recall, Ireland went through independence in 1920, and America went into prohibition not long after. And in one fell swoop, Ireland lost both access to the British Empire and America. It went bust. Distilling went bust. There was none. And in fact, that's how Pernod Ricard ultimately ended up as a monopoly from roughly the early 70s through to the mid 90s. They were the only people. They owned the 2 distilleries of Bushmills in the north and Middleton in the south. And as you know, monopoly is never a good thing. And of course, the malting houses all packed up, nothing to malt, nobody to sell it to. So that knowledge and know-how of malting using peat was lost. It's not easy using peat. It's very, very difficult. It can be, if you get it wrong, it can be carcinogenic. So again, if anybody does it in their back garden, run 100 miles because, you know, it ain't going to be good for you. So how are we going to peat this? So we took the peat, we took the 2 farms barley to Scotland, and we malted it at Glenesk.
Oh.
And there they were amazed at the difference in the peat. And we've got it on video. If you go to our website, the Waterford, there's a wonderful, wonderful video about the malting process. If you just want to know how it occurs and see it, you can almost smell it through the screen. But it's a very interesting film because the guys are amazed at, as you said, the difference of the peat. You know, we knew before that Isla peat, I lived there, you know, is very black peat. Isla is basically a rock, the oldest rocks on the planet, 2.5 billion years old. And on top of that rock is 2 meters of peat. And of course, the peat is made from the plants that were growing at the time. So this particular peat is very black, and it's so almost coal-like that, you know, if you see water on it, it gets that glycerine look. You know, when you go to a petrol gas station and you see water and you see that glycerine puddle, that's what it does. It's astonishing. You go to Orkney, and the peat's very different there. It's much browner. Our peat is still got lots of roots in it. It's a blanket peat bog. It's not 2 meters deep, it's 50 meters deep, or rather 50 meters high, because it's a peat bog that's risen upwards. Mm-hmm. So it's much more rooty. It's got all the it's browner. It's not black at all. And so it gives a very different profile, both during the malting process, as you hear during the film, but also to the whiskies. So they're both peated either side of 40 parts per million. And of course, you get this lovely, I love that hedonistic aroma of peat. I'm not a peat freak, you know, whiskey-wise, but you know, it's a lovely. But of course, you have 2 totally different whiskies. As I said earlier, the flavor compounds are immutable. They ain't going away. And they are there as clear as day. You've just got an envelope of peat. So that's your answer, that yes, peat is great. It's lovely, you know, but it doesn't dominate. It's an envelope.
This is amazing. Yeah,
I'm not sure when they come. I think Ballybannon is now in the States, but Fenniscourt will come a bit later, and then hopefully one of you can buy one and one can buy the other, and then you can compare and contrast, because it's fascinating. So Mark, exists.
So if we could get one or the other, is there one that you would suggest to get first? The Ballybannon or the Fenniscourt?
No, well, it depends how it depends how thirsty you are. I'd go for the Ballybannon because that's just arrived. There isn't much, but you know, it's really just to show you. And we were talking about aging whiskey. We wanted to show you because it's bloody good. All right. So they're not old. They're 3.5 years old. But don't think about the age. Just. That's why we don't put the age on the whiskey, on the label. We don't want you. We think the age is immaterial. It's what's in the bottle that counts. And I think increasingly, age, you will discover, is immaterial. The old stuff is not as good as it should be. The exciting stuff is the new stuff. Now, depending obviously how well it's been distilled, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we did with these 2 farms is we bottled a little bit to show you. So the rest is maturing. Next year, will show you 2 more farms, 2 different ones, peated, and you can compare and contrast. Then in 226, we'll come back to these original 2, so they'll be 2 years older, and we'll keep going on like that, so that we can keep comparing and contrasting as these 4 farms get older and older and older. It should, by my calculation, we should be able to keep that going till about 228, 229. So, you know, the whiskies will be, you know, 10, 11 years old or something like that. But regarding everything else, Waterford is only getting older. And I suppose it begs the question, if it's this good now, what's it going to be like in the years to come? I mean, I'm, you know, that's probably why I've got a big smile on my face.
But to be clear, what you're not extracting the flavors of the wood out of this aging process. From what you've said, it sounds like you're not interested in the wood as much as you are in the aging.
The micro oxidation. No, we are. Otherwise, we wouldn't use virgin oak. We use virgin oak precisely because we want that extraction.
Okay, but see, this is where I'm lost, because you say if we taste wood, you've done a bad job.
Okay, the very simple thing is we haven't bottled a virgin oak only bottling. That would be excessive. Just as we haven't done a VDN bottling only, because that would be excessive. We haven't done an only French oak. That would be excessive. What you could do is a 100% American, because that isn't excessive. Bit boring, but it's so you need this, you know, you need a bit of everything. That's the point. It's not easy. You have to know how the wood works, and you know, most distillers, they put it in the cheapest, and it's forgotten about. Conversely, a lot of new distillers don't really understand it. They think, oh, no, I'll use sexy French oak, but they don't really understand how it works or how dangerous it can be if you get it wrong. 2 things can happen. One is you get sulfur, because often the barrels are cleaned with sulfur, and that gives you that burnt rubber taste. You can see it quite often in finished wines where they've just not got it right. And the other one, the other side of it is the spirit becomes too woody because of that thickness of the wood and that strong spicy flavor. So, you know, what I'm saying is I'm a great fan of French oak, but boy, have you got to know how to use it. And I think, unfortunately, we're starting to see a rather a depressing amount of poorly worked, poorly curated bottlings that are terribly eager to scream and shout about how clever am I using French oak? Aren't I sophisticated? Chateau this, chateau that. But they, you know, they're doing it for trying to make a difference, stand out for the crowd. But actually, they just haven't done a very good job. So you know, it does come with a warning. You know, beware. So I go back to what I said earlier. My influences come unashamedly from my 20 years working in the wine industry, firsthand, meeting these extraordinary pioneering winemakers as they rediscovered the renaissance of terroir in Burgundy, using techniques learned in Napa and in Australia, modern winemaking, and I've applied that to whiskey and now to rum, Renegade rum, which is where I am now in Grenada. You think terroir's mad in Ireland? I tell you, it's completely crazy here. Obviously, but this time the plant is not barley; it's sugarcane. We'll do that next time, Kate, if you want. We'll do a rum one.
I'm willing to follow you all the way here, because this is I'm fascinated. This is amazing. I'm mind blown. I'm
Thank you very
willing
much.
to drink your peated whiskey, and everybody here will tell you how much I hate peated
Well,
anything.
me too. I'm not a
So.
great fan, but you have to try it because it's fascinating. Now,
Yeah.
the Cuvée, what I hope you find with the Cuvée is have you ever heard of the term persistence? Persistence is a winemaking term. How long after you swallowed, that flavor stays imprinted on your mind. The longer that memory stays, the more complex the wine or the spirit is. All right, so it's a very good indicator of quality. Try it with water, nothing. Oh, try it with with jug wine, not much. Try it with $20. Now you're talking. Now you're starting. It's to do with complexity. It's actually your brain being bombarded by different tramways of flavor to your brain. The more flavor is in the whiskey, the more tramways are being stimulating to your brain. So therefore, the longer it retains that memory. Now, you try that with the Cuvée, and you'll see that it lasts for 2 minutes. I've never had a whiskey that does that, ever.
Yeah, actually, the funny thing is when I saw Cuvée, I assumed it was based out of a wine cask.
No, it's a concept.
Yeah,
Cuvée concept,
it's the
I call
mix.
it.
It's the mixing.
Assemblage. It's the creative bringing together. Now, that's the first one. The upgrade of that is coming in the summer, at the end of the summer. It will be 50% older. All right. Now we're talking. Now we're getting somewhere. So
that's going to come
what's
out
its
this
base?
summer. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then in about a year, you're going to have the results of your research into why
in the
how
barrel. In the barrel. And then this spring will be about this, how terroir works. The genetic on-off switch.
Okay, can you send links to these papers to Vadim?
Oh, sure. Well, they'll be on our website when they come. When they're done. If they're peer reviewed. But it's because I want to know. We talk about it. I want to know. No one else is going to tell me. So we've had to do it ourselves.
We'll peer review it, and you'd be amazed at how many scientists and types are in this group. So we'll peer review it for you if you need it.
Well, food had our terroir one. Again, the link is on our website, and it's thanks to my American friend, Dr. Dustin Herb, up in Portland. That when I saw what he was working on, and I realized it's just by chance, and I realized that he was working around the idea of terroir for a different purpose, and I got a hold of him, and we got on very well, and he agreed to help me do this definitive study, and and we've just carried on doing 4 extra projects. So yeah, it's finding people that share a similar interest, that just want to know, life's too short. Well, let's find out why. And this is the thing about the whiskey industry. It's full of nonsense. It's full of PR people that will tell you whatever you want to hear. 80% of a whiskey's flavor. They've never made whiskey in their lives before. They've never built a distillery. They've never run a distillery. They're not responsible for the whole production and vision, and they're placemen, journeymen. And so the same rubbish gets recycled around, just like the barrels, again and again and again. And I find that very depressing, because we at Bruichladdich, when we started that, we opened the doors and let everyone in to show them how whiskey's made. Why not? We got nothing to hide. Waterford, You come in, you can go anywhere. You can wander around, you can open any cupboard you want. There's no skeletons. There's nothing to hide. The traceability, in conclusion, I would say is that, this idea of terroir is nothing unless you can prove it, which is what traceability is. And traceability is bugger all use unless you can share it, which is transparency. So if you look at the base of a bottle of Waterford, you'll see that around the bottle, okay? In the base, turn it upside down. Yeah, around there. Around the font at the bottom. I won't tell you what it says. You'll have to work it out yourself. Right, I'm going to bed now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Two quick things that we like to do is raise a glass and say thank you to you for being here. And we'll take a quick snapshot for a group photo. So cheers, everyone. Thank you so much, Mark. This has been absolutely spectacular.
Pleasure.
Well,
welcome to Waterford. Welcome to our world.
Fantastic. And then I'm genuinely curious of what everybody's favorite expression tonight was, because I've seen a lot of chatting. So we'll do a quick poll in the group, and you get to guess what you think was the group favorite, since you made these. I will definitely be in touch with Jane and with you about having you back possibly next year to talk about the next expressions. And this has been absolutely spectacular. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Oh, we got 100% votes. What do you think was the favorite tonight?
What did I think?
Yeah, what do you think this group loved the most?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know your palates, but I mean, my favorite is the Luna. But then on the other hand, I really love playing the game of going from one terroir to the other. Now, this is what I mean about drinking as opposed to pretending to taste. What I love doing is having a glass. I don't care which one, but one of the farms, okay, with water. Don't be scared to add water. Really, don't be scared. This idea, add water. I'd rather you added ice cold water than ice cubes. I prefer, cold water from the fridge because it's less of a thermal shock. But add water till you find the texture that you like, and you will find you do not dilute the flavor. You only dilute the alcohol. That's why we bottle them at 50. We expect you to add water, and you get more flavor, more texture, and it's fantastic, right? And I do that with one. So almost 50-50 is my personal preference. And then you try another one and you go off on a tangent and you go, that's fun. And then you try another one and you go off on another tangent. That to me is the pleasure. Not just one on its own, but to follow one with another, and just go with the flow. That to me is my real pleasure. Is that comparing and contrasting or following on one after the other. So if you ask me which do I prefer, I don't care which of the single farms it is. I honestly don't care. Some terroirs seem to be more interesting than others. Some we've dropped because they just don't sing. Others we've adopted because we just think they ought to be pretty funky. So that we've distilled, I said 35 farms a year, but not always the same farm. So we've actually distilled 110 different terroirs. So our maturation warehousing has got some pretty diverse things in it.
Very cool.
Yeah. Right, I'm going. I've got to go. I've got to go to bed.
No worries. We
It's
appreciate
2
your
o'clock.
time. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for spending the evening with us. This was absolutely fantastic.
Let's
Look
do
forward to
rum
having you
next.
back.
See you then.
Good night. All right, that was fun. For
He
those of
was
you at
awesome.
home following along, the winner was Cuvée, but pretty much everything else got a vote, so it was close. For those of you still on the call, I'm curious, of the single farms, if you could actually taste the difference, and which one was your favorite of the single farms? Aha.
Oh,
I thought it was really fascinating, just right off the top with the three of them side by side. It really was different, each one of them. I was kind of surprised.
Yeah, they really were
There
different.
wasn't something unifying them, like he was saying with the wood. So if you're just getting the barley, there was a little subtle difference between each of them. It was fascinating.
yeah.
Well, it's like I compared in my note, it was all of them had, I only mentioned on the common note, which was the apple, but all three of them were completely different preparations or the way the apple
Mhm.
showed up. You know, one is a fresh apple, one's a cooked apple, one is a candied apple. It's like they're commonalities because it's barley. The barreling is the same, the process is the same, but the way it expresses itself ends up being different.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why we really got to get terroir. And, you know, honestly, all the other tastings we've ever had, I don't think we've ever understood terroir until, well, I certainly haven't until tonight. And I mean, I really appreciated what he was telling us. And I was, I challenged him at the beginning because I really wanted him to really bring it to us. And I think he did. Anyway, it was great. I loved it. There's so much more to learn, that's for sure.
Awesome. That was great. The results of the last poll was the favorite was somebody else pronounced that.
Rathclogh.
There we go, that one. Rudolph. All right. That was awesome, everyone. And I will see you next time. Cheers.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Vadim.
Vadim.
Thank you, Vadim.